In the spring of 1979, International Harvester posted the best financial performance in its history. Record sales of $8.4 billion, profits soaring to $370 million, nearly double the previous year. The company's stock climbed steadily. Dealers moved equipment faster than they could stock it. The new axial flow combine was selling like nothing they'd ever seen before. For a company that had spent decades battling its smaller rival John Deere for dominance in American agriculture, this felt like vindication. 24 months later, International Harvester would report losses exceeding $600 million. Its debt would balloon to $4.5 billion. Thousands of workers would lose their jobs. Dealers across the heartland would face bankruptcy, and the company that had revolutionized American farming, that had once been larger than General Electric, Ford, and General Motors combined, would begin its final descent toward oblivion. This is not a story about creative destruction or market evolution. This is a story about how one of America's most dominant industrial giants managed to destroy itself in less than 3 years through a combination of executive arrogance, catastrophic miscalculation, and refusal to listen to the people who understood the business best. The warning signs had been accumulating for decades, but nobody wanted to see them. International Harvester's roots stretch back to 1831, when a young Virginia inventor named Cyrus Hall McCormick perfected a mechanical reaper that would transform agriculture forever. By moving his operation to Chicago in 1847, McCormick positioned himself at the center of America's expanding grain belt. His innovations turned harvesting from backbreaking manual labor into mechanized efficiency. Farmers could suddenly work larger acreages. Food production exploded. The reaper didn't just change farming, it changed the economic structure of rural America. Competition came fast. William Deering, a Maine textile magnate, saw opportunity in farm equipment and built his own empire. By the 1990s, both McCormick and Deering operated massive Chicago factories. McCormick's South Side plant covered over 1 million square feet. Deering's North Side facility employed 7,000 men. They battled for every dealer, every farmer's dollar, every technological edge. The competition bled both companies. In 1902, banker J.P. Morgan orchestrated a merger that created International Harvester. McCormick Harvesting Machine Company, Deering Harvester Company, and 3 smaller manufacturers combined into a near monopoly valued at $150 million. It was industrial consolidation at its most aggressive. Morgan eliminated competition to maximize profits. The McCormick family maintained control through carefully structured ownership. For the next half-century, International Harvester dominated American agriculture. In 1917, the company was larger than General Electric, Ford, or General Motors. By the 1930s, IH commanded 44% of the U.S. tractor market with its Farmall brand, double the share of second-place John Deere. The company built a reputation for durability, innovation, and a dealer network that reached into every farming community. IH machines painted bright red became as recognizable in rural America as the grain elevators and railroad depots that structured small-town life. But dominance breeds complacency, and complacency creates vulnerability. After World War II, cracks began showing in International Harvester's foundation. The company that had revolutionized agriculture was now being outmaneuvered by a smaller, nimbler competitor from Moline, Illinois. John Deere had spent decades as the perpetual runner-up, always chasing IH's market share. In the late 1950s, that dynamic began to shift. John Deere invested in engineering. John Deere listened to farmers. John Deere moved faster. In 1958, IH launched its 60 Series tractors with great fanfare, hosting over 12,000 dealers at its Hinsdale, Illinois testing farm. The centerpiece machines were the 6-cylinder 460 and 560 models, promising unprecedented power. Within a year, the tractors were recalled. Final drive components hadn't been updated since 1939 and failed rapidly under the stress of the more powerful engines. Some farmers lost entire harvests waiting for repairs. Others simply walked away from International Harvester and bought John Deere's new generation of power tractors introduced in 1960. That single engineering failure cost IH something more valuable than money. It cost them trust. Throughout the 1960s, International Harvester remained formidable. Sales stayed strong. The product line expanded into construction equipment, trucks, and consumer products like Cub Cadet lawnmowers. But profit margins grew thinner each year. The company was spreading itself across too many markets without dominating any of them. By 1963, John Deere surpassed International Harvester to become America's largest agricultural equipment manufacturer. IH still held second place, still commanded respect, still employed tens of thousands across its sprawling operations. But the trajectory had shifted. The 1970s arrived with new pressures: rising labor costs, increasing competition from Caterpillar in construction, from Ford in trucks, from Deere everywhere. Manufacturing facilities built in the early 1900s needed expensive modernization. Union contracts negotiated during boom years now looked increasingly generous compared to competitors. Wall Street analysts noticed. International Harvester's returns on investment lagged behind rivals. Something had to change. In 1977, the McCormick family made the decision that would seal the company's fate. After 75 years of family management, the board decided International Harvester needed outside expertise. They needed someone from the modern corporate world, someone who understood cost-cutting, efficiency metrics, strategic rationalization, someone who could shake up a complacent culture. They recruited Archie McArdle from Xerox Corporation, offering him one of the most lavish compensation packages in American business history.
Archie McArdle arrived at International Harvester in August 1977 with the confidence of a man who believed corporate problems could be solved through financial engineering. His credentials seemed impeccable. He'd spent nearly 3 decades at Ford Motor Company, rising through financial management ranks. At Xerox, he'd been president during years of record profits. The board of directors believed they'd hired a turnaround specialist. They'd actually hired a demolition expert. McArdle's compensation package revealed everything about how badly International Harvester misunderstood their situation. Base salary of $460,000 made him one of the highest paid CEOs in America. A $1.5 million signing bonus. A $1.8 million loan at 6% interest, far below market rates, which the company promised to forgive if McArdle improved IH's performance relative to competitors. That loan forgiveness would later become a powder keg. McArdle moved fast. He fired 11,000 of the company's 15,000 mid- and upper-level managers, believing they were too cozy with union representatives. He launched a $640 million cost-cutting program. He committed $789 million over 3 years to modernize outdated plants. On paper, the strategy looked aggressive and decisive, but in reality, McArdle was dismantling institutional knowledge while making massive capital commitments without understanding the cyclical nature of agricultural markets. The immediate results seemed to justify his approach. In 1979, International Harvester posted those record numbers. Sales up nearly 26%, profits doubled. Wall Street analysts praised McArdle's tough management style, but experienced IH dealers noticed something troubling. The company was pushing equipment into dealer inventories regardless of market conditions. Manufacturing was ramping up production targets without considering whether farmers could afford to buy. And McArdle's management team was making decisions without consulting the people who actually understood farming. Throughout 1979, McArdle became fixated on labor costs. He believed International Harvester's union contracts were dragging down profitability compared to competitors, like John Deere and Caterpillar. IH workers had negotiated favorable terms over decades, including the right to refuse overtime and transfer to any open position based on seniority. To McArdle, these were inefficiencies that needed elimination. He decided to provoke a confrontation. The UAW contract expired November 1st. Instead of negotiating quietly, McArdle went public with demands. He wanted mandatory overtime, restrictions on job transfers, work rule changes that would fundamentally alter how the company operated. McArdle claimed these inefficiencies had cost International Harvester $1.3 billion over 3 years. He positioned the negotiations as existential. The union saw it differently. Just weeks before the contract expired, International Harvester announced those record profits, and McArdle's compensation package became public knowledge. Workers learned their CEO had received a $1.8 million loan, while management demanded they give up rights earned through generations of negotiation. The timing was catastrophic. On November 1st, 35,000 workers walked off the job. McArdle expected a quick resolution. He believed the union would cave within weeks, grateful to preserve jobs. Instead, the strike became a test of wills neither side could afford to lose. International Harvester's negotiators were inexperienced, having relied on McArdle's team rather than managers who understood labor relations. The company made tactical errors that prolonged the conflict. Going public with bargaining positions eliminated room to maneuver. Attacking seniority and overtime simultaneously gave the union no incentive to compromise on anything. As November turned to December, the strike ground on. Production stopped. Dealers watched inventory dwindle. Farmers looking to buy equipment turned to John Deere, Caterpillar, Ford, anyone still manufacturing. Every day International Harvester's plant sat silent was another day competitors gained market share they'd never surrender. December brought more bad news. On the 15th, the UAW settled a strike at Caterpillar, ending what had been the longest walkout in that company's history. Caterpillar made concessions and got back to work. The comparison made International Harvester's situation look increasingly foolish. Days later, IH reported its fiscal year results. Despite the strike, yearly profits had reached $369.9 million on sales of $8.4 billion. The union used these numbers to argue the company could easily afford current contracts. By January 1980, reality was setting in at International Harvester headquarters. The company announced that if the strike continued, first-quarter losses could reach $225 million, 10% of shareholder equity. Banks were getting nervous, customers were defecting. The strike that was supposed to strengthen IH's competitive position was destroying it instead. Then the economy collapsed. In January 1980, President Jimmy Carter imposed a grain embargo on the Soviet Union in response to the invasion of Afghanistan. American grain exports, projected at 124.6 million metric tons for the year, plummeted to 107.1 million metric tons. Grain futures fell sharply. Farmers watching commodity prices crater stopped thinking about buying new equipment. They started thinking about survival. At the moment, interest rates exploded. The prime rate, which had been 11.75% in late 1978, hit 15.75% by early 1980 and kept climbing. Farmers who might have financed new tractors or combines at reasonable rates couldn't justify borrowing at these levels. Dealers who carried inventory on credit watched their costs skyrocket. International Harvester faced a perfect storm. No production because of the strike, collapsing demand because of the embargo and interest rates, rising short-term debt because plants sat idle while bills kept coming. In April 1980, the company's short-term debt exploded from $442 million to over $1 billion. McArdle had miscalculated everything. He'd provoked a strike assuming the union would fold quickly. He'd ramped up production in 1979, assuming dealers would restock after the strike ended. He committed hundreds of millions to plant modernization, assuming strong markets would continue. Every assumption proved catastrophically wrong. On April 20th, 1980, after 172 days, the strike finally ended. At the time, it was the longest strike in UAW history and the longest in International Harvester's history. The settlement gave the union virtually everything it had fought for. Workers kept their transfer rights, mandatory overtime remained off the table. The work rules McArdle insisted were critical to the company's survival stayed largely intact. UAW negotiator Pat Greathouse called the contract an overwhelming victory. Wall Street analysts agreed. One told reporters bluntly that International Harvester was the big loser. The company had lost $479.4 million during the strike. It would lose another $397.3 million in fiscal year 2020. Market share vanished, dealer confidence evaporated. And McArdle's modernization program now looked like a multi-$100 million investment in capacity the company would never use. Dealers understood the disaster before corporate headquarters did. While Archie McCardle insisted International Harvester would roar back after the strike, people who actually sold farm equipment to actual farmers knew better. The market had changed fundamentally during those 6 months of silence. In Belvidere, Illinois, dealer Jim Wallem watched his customer base disappear. Before the strike, his International Harvester dealership had sold 12 new combines in October 1979 alone, over 20 dozen for the full year. The axial flow combine had been a genuine hit, a machine farmers wanted. Then came the strike, the embargo, the interest rate explosion. Suddenly, Wallen was going to the courthouse every Monday to collect bankruptcy filings from the previous week, searching for customers' names on the list. Many had open accounts at his dealership, past due balances from engine overhauls and parts. The moment he saw their names on the bankruptcy list, he knew he'd never collect. One dairy farmer, a friend and longtime customer, sat down in Wallem's office, closed the door, and cried as he explained he'd declared bankruptcy. The financial and emotional toll rippled through rural America. These weren't just business transactions, these were generations-old relationships between dealers and farming families who'd bought International Harvester equipment since the days of Cyrus McCormick's first reapers. Another customer came in at harvest peak and bought a combine. Wallen was certain the credit application would be approved. The farmer had always paid on time, maintained good credit. The application was rejected. Banks had grown terrified of agricultural lending. They saw the collapsing commodity prices, the soaring interest rates, the auction notices appearing in every rural newspaper. They stopped extending credit even to solid customers. McCardle and his management team had made a catastrophic assumption during the strike. They believed dealers would need to restock inventory immediately after production resumed. That pent-up demand would drive a surge in orders. Truck and farm equipment production continued during and after the strike, filling yards with unsold machines. Management kept manufacturing, convinced the restock orders would arrive any day. They never came. Dealers didn't need inventory. They needed customers who could afford to buy, customers who weren't facing farm foreclosure, customers who weren't watching interest rates climb toward 20%. Instead of empty showrooms waiting to be filled, dealers had too much inventory they couldn't move, inventory they were paying interest on while it sat gathering dust. By late 1980, International Harvester's yards were packed with unsold equipment representing hundreds of millions in tied-up capital. The manufacturing plants McCardle had modernized at tremendous expense stood idle. Workers faced layoffs. The debt taken on to weather the strike and upgrade facilities came due while revenue collapsed. In October 1980, International Harvester reported losses from continuing operations of $374.8 million for fiscal year 1980. The company announced massive layoffs. In January 1981, corporate officers took a 29% pay cut. Wages for salaried employees froze. The UAW was asked to consider contract concessions. February 1981 brought a first quarter loss of $96.4 million. In May, International Harvester sold its profitable solar turbines division to rival Caterpillar for $500 million, desperately trying to raise cash. In June, the company suspended common stock dividends for the first time in 71 years. Preferred stock dividends followed in October. The debt situation was becoming existential. Rising interest rates made International Harvester's borrowing costs unbearable. The company owed $4.5 billion to 225 different lenders. In September 1981, IH reached an agreement in principle to restructure that debt, buying 3 more years before major payments came due. It was barely enough to stay off bankruptcy. October 1981 delivered the worst news yet. Fiscal year losses hit $635.7 million on sales of just $7 billion, down dramatically from that $8.4 billion in that record year before the strike. The company that had been printing money 24 months earlier was hemorrhaging cash so fast that bankruptcy seemed inevitable. The 1980s farm crisis was deepening across rural America. It wasn't just International Harvester. Entire farming communities faced extinction. High interest rates, low commodity prices, and the grain embargo had created conditions worse than any time since the Great Depression. Farmers were auctioning off land their families had worked for generations. Equipment sales across the industry collapsed. In some extreme cases, farmers facing financial ruin took their own lives. But International Harvester's situation was worse than competitors. John Deere, Caterpillar, and others also faced declining sales, but they hadn't provoked 6-month strikes. They hadn't ramped up production into a collapsing market. They hadn't taken on billions in debt right before the economy imploded.
And crucially, they still had the trust of their dealer networks and customers. International Harvester had squandered that trust. By 1982, the company was cutting everything. In January, IH announced plans to reduce the workforce by 25%, consolidating operations and closing facilities. But then McArdle made his final catastrophic error. After months of begging the UAW for wage concessions, after implementing pay cuts for corporate officers, after laying off thousands, International Harvester paid out $6 million in bonuses to 3,300 managers. The timing was staggeringly tone-deaf. The UAW had been negotiating potential concessions that could save the company $100 million. When news of the executive bonuses broke, the union walked away from talks. Workers were being asked to sacrifice while management rewarded itself. The optics were indefensible. February 1982 brought another quarter loss of $299.4 million. In March, President and CEO Warren Hayford resigned, unable to convince McArdle that the company's situation was more dire than McArdle believed. Hayford had been pushing for more extensive cost-cutting, for recognition that International Harvester was circling the drain. McArdle rejected those warnings. By May, the losses had reached $198.3 million for the second quarter. Rumors swirled that bankruptcy was imminent. The company denied it. Banks were losing patience. The UAW reopened negotiations, terrified the company would collapse entirely. On May 2nd, the union ratified a new contract granting International Harvester $200 million in wage, benefit, and pension concessions over 3 years. That next day, Archie McArdle was fired. Time magazine later wrote that the real wonder was McArdle hadn't been ousted much earlier. The board of directors met over a weekend, pushed by debtor banks who demanded change. McArdle insisted he'd resigned. Industry observers and the press knew better. He was fired. Louis Mank replaced McArdle as chairman and CEO. Donald Lennox became chief operating officer. The company's stock, trading in the mid-40s when McArdle was hired, now traded at $2. International Harvester had lost $2.4 billion between fiscal years 1980 and 1982, the largest 3-year loss in American corporate history at that time. 6 months after leaving International Harvester, McArdle spoke to a group at Harvard Business School. When asked to assess his own performance, he replied that despite some regrets, he thought he rated himself superb. In 1986, he told UPI he felt very good about his years at Harvard.
The new management team inherited a company in free fall. Stopping the bleeding required immediate amputation. International Harvester began selling everything that wasn't bolted to the floor and even some things that were. In 1982, the construction equipment division was sold to Dresser Industries. These were profitable operations, but they generated cash the company desperately needed to service debt. Piece by piece, the empire that had taken 80 years to build was being dismantled. The product lines that remained faced their own crisis. International Harvester had actually developed excellent equipment in the 1970s. The 88 series tractors, introduced in the early 1980s, were stylish, progressive machines with advanced features. Under normal circumstances, they should have dominated the market. But circumstances weren't normal. The agricultural equipment market was experiencing the worst collapse in modern history. Farmers were going bankrupt, not buying new tractors. The 88 series arrived with fanfare but inadequate sales simply because nobody could afford to purchase farm equipment at any price. Dealers faced impossible choices. Those who remained loyal to International Harvester watched their businesses crumble. Many switched to John Deere or other competitors trying to salvage something from the wreckage. Some closed entirely, ending family businesses that had served their communities for generations. The human cost rippled through small towns across the Midwest and Great Plains. When an International Harvester dealer shut down, it wasn't just a business closing, it was a community institution disappearing, jobs vanishing, service and parts support evaporating. Larry Smith of O'Neill's Farm Equipment in Binbrook, Ontario, later recalled that learning Tenneco had purchased International Harvester's farm equipment division felt like losing his family. That sentiment was shared by thousands of dealers and tens of thousands of employees. International Harvester wasn't just a corporation. For many, it represented generations of family employment, community identity, a connection to the machinery that had shaped American agriculture. The company staggered through 1983 and 1984, losing money, closing plants, laying off workers. The debt restructuring bought time, but not salvation. By 1984, International Harvester's agricultural equipment division was losing money at an unsustainable rate. The company had no choice. The division had to be sold. In November 1984, Tenneco acquired International Harvester's agricultural equipment business for $488 million. The deal closed in January 1985. Tenneco merged IH's operations with its own JIC division, creating Case IH. The merger was profoundly ironic. JIC had been one of International Harvester's longtime competitors, a company IH had once dwarfed in size and scope. Now, Case was absorbing what remained of the giant. For farmers and dealers, the merger created deep uncertainty. Would parts remain available for older equipment? Would warranties be honored? Would the legendary red tractors continue under a different owner? Case IH kept producing equipment, maintained most dealer relationships, and honored commitments. But the International Harvester brand, the name that had defined American agriculture for over 8 decades, was gone. What remained was renamed Navistar International Corporation in 1986. The company focused exclusively on trucks and engines, shutting every connection to its agricultural past except the institutional memory of employees who'd weathered the storm. Navistar survived and eventually returned to profitability. Today, it remains a significant player in commercial truck manufacturing, but it's a shadow of what International Harvester once represented. The collapse devastated employment across International Harvester's operations. At its peak, IH employed over 100,000 people. The layoffs, plant closures, and division sales eliminated tens of thousands of jobs. Workers who'd expected to retire from International Harvester found themselves scrambling for employment in their 50s and 60s. Many had specialized skills in farm machinery manufacturing that weren't transferable to other industries. Some found work with Case IH or competitors. Others retrained entirely, leaving manufacturing for service sector jobs that paid far less. The city of Chicago, where International Harvester had been born and maintained major operations, suffered particularly hard. The company had been a pillar of Chicago's industrial economy for over a century. The McCormick and Deering factories had employed thousands, shaped neighborhoods, provided stable working-class incomes through multiple generations. Their closure contributed to Chicago's broader deindustrialization, hollowing out working-class communities that depended on manufacturing jobs. Fort Wayne, Indiana, where International Harvester built scout vehicles and heavy trucks, faced similar devastation. Rock Island, Illinois, where the company manufactured farmall tractors, lost its economic anchor. These weren't just factory closings, they were the end of industrial ecosystems that had supported entire regions. The dealer network collapse created its own crisis in rural America. International Harvester dealerships had been fixtures in small towns for generations. They provided jobs, purchased local services, sponsored community events. When dealers closed, small towns lost not just businesses, but gathering places, sources of local expertise, connections to the broader agricultural economy. The ripple effects touched insurance agents, banks, restaurants, parts suppliers, mechanics, everyone whose livelihood connected to farm equipment. Farmers who'd invested in International Harvester equipment faced their own problems. Machines that were still functional and productive suddenly had questionable parts support. Resale values collapsed. A farmer who'd financed an expensive tractor expecting it to hold value through many years watched that equity evaporate. Some walked away from equipment entirely, taking financial losses rather than trying to maintain machines without reliable dealer support. The failure also damaged trust in American agricultural equipment manufacturing generally. If a giant like International Harvester could collapse, what did that say about the industry's stability? John Deere benefited enormously, consolidating its position as the unquestioned market leader. Farmers increasingly viewed Deere as the safe choice, the company that would be there in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. That perception advantage, earned partly through Deere's genuine competence and partly through IH's catastrophic failure, has persisted for 4 decades. Financially, the International Harvester collapse represented one of the most dramatic destructions of shareholder value in American business history. Investors who'd held IH stock expecting steady returns from a blue-chip industrial company watched their investments become nearly worthless. Pension funds, individual investors, employees with stock options, all suffered massive losses. The question that haunted everyone who watched International Harvester implode was simple. How did this happen?
The destruction of International Harvester wasn't inevitable. It was the result of specific decisions made by specific people at specific moments. Understanding how a company that had dominated American agriculture for 8 decades could collapse in less than 3 years requires examining not just what happened, but why those who could have prevented it failed to act. International Harvester's vulnerability had been building since the 1950s. The company's complacency after World War II created the opening John Deere exploited. While IH rested on its market position, Deere invested in engineering, listened to farmers, improved dealer relationships. The 1958 final drive failures weren't just mechanical problems. They revealed a company that had grown careless about quality, that prioritized marketing over engineering, that pushed products to market before they were ready. But these were survivable problems. Many companies lose market leadership to more agile competitors without experiencing catastrophic collapse. International Harvester in 1977 was still an enormous, profitable enterprise. It had challenges, certainly. Profit margins needed improvement, manufacturing needed modernization, labor costs were higher than competitors, but these were manageable issues for competent leadership. The board's decision to hire Archie McCardle represented a fundamental misunderstanding of what the company needed. They believed IH's problems were financial and operational, solvable through cost-cutting and efficiency improvements. They wanted someone who would rationalize operations, impose discipline, force difficult changes. They got all of that, but they failed to recognize that International Harvester's real problems were cultural and strategic. The company had lost touch with its customers. Management made decisions without understanding farming's cyclical nature, without recognizing that agricultural equipment sales depend on commodity prices, weather, credit conditions, factors completely outside any company's control. McCardle compounded this disconnection by firing thousands of experienced managers who understood these dynamics, replacing them with financial analysts who saw everything through spreadsheets. The strike decision revealed McCardle's fundamental blindness, provoking a labor confrontation over work rules while posting record profits showed astonishing political tone deafness. Going public with bargaining positions eliminated negotiating room. Attacking multiple union issues simultaneously left no space for compromise. Any experienced labor negotiator could have predicted disaster, but McCardle surrounded himself with people who shared his certainty, who believed unions would capitulate to superior management will. The assumption that dealers would restock after the strike showed similar blindness to market realities. Dealers watching commodity prices collapse, interest rates soar, and customers declare bankruptcy knew immediately that equipment demand would crater. Corporate management, isolated from these ground-level realities, manufactured tractors and combines nobody could buy, tying up capital and inventory while debt service consumed operating cash. McCardle's compensation package, particularly the $1.8 million forgiven loan, created a perception problem that poisoned every subsequent negotiation. Workers asked to sacrifice watched their CEO receive rewards that seemed obscene given company performance. When IH paid executive bonuses while begging union concessions, it destroyed any remaining trust. Leadership requires credibility. McCardle spent hers through careless disregard for how his actions appeared to the people doing the actual work. But McCardle alone didn't destroy International Harvester. The board of directors enabled every decision. They hired him. They structured the compensation package. They supported the strike strategy. They approved manufacturing decisions that buried the company in unsold inventory. They waited until May 1982, after $2.4 billion in losses, before finally removing him. Their failure was governance, the fundamental responsibility to provide oversight and correct course when management pursues destructive strategies. The debtor banks also share responsibility. They lent billions to a company showing obvious signs of distress. They restructured debt rather than forcing management changes earlier. Banking relationships prioritize maintaining credit relationships over acknowledging bad decisions. The banks that financed International Harvester's expansion enabled the collapse by providing capital long after prudence would have demanded cutting off credit. The broader context matters too. The 1980s farm crisis would have hurt International Harvester regardless of management quality. Collapsing commodity prices, soaring interest rates, the grain embargo, these factors devastated agricultural equipment demand across the industry. John Deere sales fell too. Caterpillar struggled. But those companies survived because they hadn't mortally wounded themselves through strike losses, inventory miscalculations, and destroyed dealer relationships. Perhaps the most tragic element is humility. International Harvester once believed itself too large, too dominant, too essential to fail.
Cyrus McCormick's Reaper had changed civilization. The company that grew from his innovation had survived depressions, wars, competitive assaults. That history created dangerous confidence that the company would always endure. But no company survives bad leadership indefinitely. No market position is permanent. No dominance is unassailable. International Harvester's collapse proved that the largest industrial giants can destroy themselves through arrogance, miscalculation, and refusal to listen to people who understand the business better than the people in charge. The fields still get plowed. The grain still gets harvested. The machines still run, painted red and bearing different names, carrying forward the mechanical lineage of innovations that began nearly 200 years ago. But the company that made those innovations possible, that employed hundreds of thousands, that shaped agriculture and industry and the American landscape itself, exists now only in memory and museum exhibits and the rusting equipment still working on farms whose owners remember when International Harvester meant something more than a name on old tractors. That is the legacy of the nearly impossible downfall. Not that it couldn't happen, but that it did.